Hello and welcome to pmclounge.com. In this video, we are going over the Agile Manifesto values. And there's a website called agilemanifesto.org. If you want to go over that website, it talks about the values. And there are basically values and principles behind the Agile Manifesto. So in this video, we are going over only the values behind the Agile Manifesto. Now, of course, this video covers the Agile part of your PMP exam. PMP is now 50% Agile in case you have been living under a rock. So this video is going to be helpful if you're preparing for the Agile part for your PMP exam. And this video is also going to be helpful if you're preparing for your PMI-ACP exam. As always, if you're into reading articles, if you would rather read about the Agile Manifesto values than watch this video, then you can check the first link in the description below. It will take you to a relevant article on this topic over at our official website pmclounge.com. So that being clear, that being said, let's get started and understand the Agile Manifesto values. A quick reminder, please do like this video. That seems to be the only way YouTube is going to let you know every time we upload new content. So the question here is Agile the answer? Is Agile the answer to every single project management problem that you are facing? Well, to be frank, if you are on traditional waterfall model and if your project allows for a move to Agile, you are definitely going to see big improvements. But to think that Agile is the answer to everything wrong with your projects, that is absolutely wrong. And the first thing to note here is that many teams actually struggle with Agile when they, transform from waterfall or traditional way of project management to an Agile way of project management. Many teams actually struggle. The reason for that, the biggest reason for that, is the fact that Agile is a mindset. It's not something that you study and start applying. It is a shift in the mindset. And your team needs to have the right mindset to apply Agile, to use the Agile ways of project management. Unless that happens, Agile is not going to be successful and your teams are going to struggle with Agile. So Agile does promise big improvements, but it is not the answer to everything wrong with your projects. But in order to realize these big improvements, what you need is a shift in the mindset. What you need is the right mindset, the Agile mindset. So how do you develop the Agile mindset? Well, that's where you enter the Agile Manifesto. And Agile Manifesto is where the team understands the values and principles of Agile. When the team understands the values and principles of Agile, that's where the team starts to think differently and it becomes more effective. So Agile is not just about introducing a set of new tools and a set of new techniques and a set of new daily Scrum meetings. No, you cannot move from waterfall to Agile by introducing stuff like these. What you need to introduce and what you need to ensure that your team understands are the values and principles of Agile. And this is where a lot of teams struggle because they introduce the tools and techniques, they introduce the daily Scrum meetings thinking that they are doing Agile, but the team is not really understanding the values and principles of Agile. And that is why the team does not have Agile mindset. So how did this Agile Manifesto came about? There's a little backstory which we will look at in the next slide about it. So here's the little backstory about the Agile Manifesto. In the 1990s, there was a growing movement and a growing frustration with the traditional waterfall model, the traditional waterfall way of managing projects. The reason for that was because, you have to define strict requirements, and you need to complete design, and you need to do the, architecture of the software before the code is written. So you do a lot of work before the code is written, and the requirements were so hard bound that introducing change was also very, very difficult. So everybody wanted something lightweight, something that is not as difficult and as traditional, so to say, as the waterfall model. So that's how in 2001 a group of 17 people, open-minded people, they got together at the Snowboard Sky Resort in the mountains of Salt Lake City, Utah in USA. Now, this group included leaders from across the world, and everybody wanted to come up with something which was lightweight. Lightweight was the keyword here. Everybody wanted a process which is not as hard and as heavyweight as the waterfall. Everybody wanted to come up with something which is lightweight in order to build software. So it didn't took too long for this group of 17 people to come up with the Agile Manifesto. And that's how Agile Manifesto came about. Basically, the group of 17 people, they converged to four values, and these four values were documented and they became the values of Agile Manifesto. And we are going to look at the values, all those four values in the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the four values of Agile Manifesto. The first one is individual and interactions over process and tools. Individual and interactions over process and tools. Next is working software over comprehensive documentation. Remember how I told you in the previous slide that you have to come up with requirements, you do your architecture, you do your design, and that's when you start coding. So working software over all this comprehensive documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and finally responding to change over following a plan. Plan the work, work the plan. That was not something that Agile Manifesto talked about. It said that you should respond to change rather than following a plan. So these were the four values of the Agile Manifesto. And what this signifies is, while there is a lot of value in these sentences that you see here, process and tools, comprehensive documentation, contract negotiation, following a plan, all these have value. The Agile Manifesto agrees to it. There is value in all of these, but what Agile proposes is that these items, individual and interactions, working software, customer collaboration, responding to change, these values are more important than process and tools, comprehensive documentation, contract negotiation, and following a plan. So there is value in all of these, but these are more important to agile teams and to develop the agile mindset. A quick reminder, head over to youtube.com/PMC Lounge/playlists. That's where the gold is. All our videos are neatly arranged in playlists there. So let's look at the four values one by one. The first one is individuals and interactions over process and tools. Remember how I told you that process and tools are also important, but more important is individuals and interactions when it comes to agile. So this does not mean that the daily stand-ups, user stories, burn down charts, retrospectives, they are not important. Of course, these are all important. These are all process and tools of the agile way of delivering project, right? Daily stand-up is basically a tool. User stories, coming up with user stories, burn down chart is also a tool. Retrospective, that is a process. All of these are important, but at the same time, individuals and interactions are more important. So if you ask a scrum master or an agile project manager, they are going to tell you the issues that they have with daily stand up. And everybody, cries about daily stand up, how the daily stand up is not working, how the most difficult part of adopting agile is stuff like daily stand up, which is basically a process, a tool to adopt the agile way of delivering project, right? So the problem that they have with daily stand up, this problem arises because the focus here is not on individuals and interactions. You are focusing too much on a tool called the daily stand up. So speak to individuals, have interactions with the individuals, and try to understand how you can make the daily stand up work. It is just a tool. It is possible that you don't need a daily stand up. Remember, individuals and interactions are more important than process and tools. Individual people on the team are more important, and any tool being introduced due to agile should improve their interactions with stakeholders. So if you are introducing daily stand up, ideally it should improve the interactions with the project stakeholders. It should not be added as a burden on the agile team. All right, so the next point is working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, of course, this might be contentious because does this mean that comprehensive documentation is not important? Well, it doesn't say so. What it says is comprehensive documentation is important, but when you have agile mindset, you pay more importance to working software over comprehensive documentation. And why do we say so? Let's take an example. So if there are two people, they can interpret the same requirement or the same set of requirements or the requirement documentation or the entire design documentation. These two people can interpret such documentation differently. And comprehensive documentation might actually make things worse. So it is possible that you have a same requirement, same set of requirements, or the same design document read by two different people and interpreted totally differently, which is why comprehensive documentation is not something that is given more importance than working software. Working software matters most, and that is why the most effective way for a user to judge how well the software works is by actually using it. And that is what Agile gives you. Agile gives you working software instead of comprehensive documentation to study and go over, and then end of the day end up with some kind of disputes over what you thought was the requirement versus what the customer thought the requirement was. But documentation, we are not actually saying that documentation is not required. Documentation is needed, and it is specially needed when you are measuring the quality. Unless you have documented somewhere the measure of quality for the end product or for the working software, you might fall in a situation where nobody knows what quality of code is expected, what quality of working software is expected. So documentation is definitely needed. Without a certain level of documentation, it is actually impossible to figure out whether or not the software is working, right? Because you might get a piece of software and you don't know how to test it, how to figure out whether it is working or not. And that is why some level of documentation is needed so that you can read, consider it as user manual. You need user manual no matter how good your product is. And that is how quality documentation is also needed, so that a user can read that documentation and then test the software accordingly to ensure whether or not it is working. All right, so value number 3 in the Agile Manifesto is customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Now, I know what you're thinking. How come customer collaboration is more important than contract negotiation? I mean, don't you need a contract to start working on the project? Don't you need a contract that defines everything in complete details? How can customer collaboration have more importance than contract negotiation? So don't get too hung up on this term contract negotiation, because contract negotiation here, it does not represent actual contracts. It does not represent what consultants deal with or the procurement managers deal with. This is more about the attitude that people have. So here's an example. In order to work together, everyone must come to an explicit agreement and adhere to it strictly. So 2 points here: explicit agreement and adhere to it strictly. Strictly, it needs to be adhered, whatever the explicit agreement has been. This is what contract negotiation here represents. And you got it right. When we say customer collaboration over contract negotiation, we mean that you should collaborate with your customer rather than having explicit agreements and asking them to adhere to it strictly. That's what Agile is all about. Now, Agile teams, they understand that projects change and people never have perfect information when starting things off. So at the beginning of the project, as an Agile team, you realize that the customer does not have every single requirement from the project, right? They have an idea, they have certain requirements that they are looking for, but they don't have perfect information about what they are looking for, because the project is just getting started. This is the least that you know about the project. This is the time when you know least about the project. And to have explicit agreements and expecting that people are going to adhere to those explicit agreements strictly, that's way too much. That's contract negotiation, which Agile teams think is less important than collaborating with the customer. So instead of nailing down exactly what would be built before the project even starts, something that we do all the time in traditional waterfall projects, right? So instead of doing this, Agile teams collaborate with the customers for best results. Now, here's an important point to note. This does not mean that contract negotiation or having explicit agreements and adhering to those agreements, this does not mean that this isn't important, right? You need to have agreements. You need to stick to those agreements. You need to adhere to those agreements, especially when the customer is someone who isn't collaborating enough and who is unreasonable, right? So a customer who keeps changing the requirements and doesn't even give you the time to make those changes, then obviously you need to pay attention to contract negotiation, which means you need to pay attention to having some explicit agreements and adhering to those agreements strictly. So it is important when we say customer collaboration over contract negotiation, it is important that even the customer understands the Agile mindset. Even the customer understands the values of the Agile Manifesto. Because if the customer does not understand it, and the customer is someone who keeps changing his requirements, and he is not giving you the time or the resources, the money to incorporate those changes, right? Then it obviously means that the customer does not have an Agile mindset. So as long as the customer have an Agile mindset, you can definitely pay more attention to customer collaboration rather than contract negotiation. Finally, value number 4 of the Agile Manifesto is responding to change over following a plan. And if you ask me personally, I think this is the most important value of Agile Manifesto. Because if you're working in a non-agile environment, you know, changes are actually frowned upon. It's so difficult to implement changes because you have your change management processes, you have your change control board, you have change advisory board, and it just makes incorporating changes very difficult because you want to stick to your plan, right? A plan that you created when the project was in its initiating phase, when everyone knew very less about the project. You created a plan then, and now you do not want to change. If changes come in, you have very heavyweight complex processes to incorporate changes, and that is why, that is one thing that agile totally destroys. Agile asks you to respond to these changes rather than sticking to your plan which you created in the beginning, right? The issue with plan the work the plan, which is something that we use when we define traditional project management: plan the work the plan. The issue with this is that an incorrect plan will lead to an incorrect product of the project. Very true. Another problem is that plans are created in the beginning when the team knows the least about the project, something that we talked about already, right? So in the initiating phases, when people know the least about the project, that's when you're creating a plan. And if you have an incorrect plan, it will result in an incorrect product of the project. So that is why, instead of following a plan is also important, but more importance should be given to responding to change. Now, Agile uses methodologies that have tools to constantly look for changes and respond to them. Now, this is again a big differentiator between agile and non-agile ways of delivering projects. In agile, you are constantly looking for changes and you are looking to respond to them as well. In traditional project management, you might be looking for changes, but you might be looking to avoid the changes to ensure that if a change comes in, it goes through a very complex, very heavyweight process, and it is almost frowned upon. Nobody likes change requests. This is in direct contrast to change control procedures of traditional waterfall projects, something that we talked about. Another important point here is progressive elaboration. We have talked about this term actually earlier. I'll share a link, third link in the description, where we've talked about progressive elaboration in a video. So progressive elaboration is used by drawing knowledge at every subsequent step. So at every subsequent step, you're drawing knowledge from your previous step. Of course, planning is important, but it is more important to realize that plans change as we work on the project. So realize that plans do change as we work on the project. So planning, we are not discounting planning. It is important, but changes, incorporating them is also very important. Finally, here's the thing. There is value in the items on the right. So towards your right, you have certain items and there is value in all of them. Process and tools, comprehensive documentation, contract negotiation, following a plan. There is value in all of these. But for agile mindset, we value the items on the left more. So we value individuals and interactions. We value working software, customer collaboration. We value responding to change more than the items on the right. Question for this video: which is your favorite Agile Manifesto value? Like I mentioned, we have talked about all four values, and for me, it is responding to change over following a plan. Which is your favorite Agile Manifesto value? Note that this is also a good question from your job perspective. So having an answer to this is going to help. So prepare an answer, drop it in the comments, and let me know which is your favorite Agile Manifesto value. Also, do you know about the principles behind the Agile Manifesto value? So we've talked about the values in this video. In the next video, we'll talk about the principles behind the Agile Manifesto. But do you know about them? Let me know in the comments if you do. And that's all that we had in this video. I hope you got value out of it. I hope you were able to understand the Agile Manifesto values. Smash that like button if you got value out of this video. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to stay notified every time we upload new content. Also, don't forget to check out the website pnclounge.com, your #1 free PMP resource.